Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's community call hosted by Everyone In. My name's Danny Donez. I'm here representing Swell Creative Group and the Everyone In campaign. In just another minute, I'll turn things over to our moderator and we'll begin today's conversation. But we'll first wait just a few moments to allow more people to join. At any point during today's discussion, if we notice that somebody's microphone has accidentally been left on, we may go ahead and mute it. A reminder that only you are able to unmute yourself. We've received a ton of questions prior to today's event, and please feel free to make use of the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you would like your questions answered today. Again, thank you for joining us for today's community call. Now it is my pleasure to introduce and turn things over to our moderator, Gustavo Arellano.
Hi, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gustavo Arellano. I'm a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and welcome to today's conversation. And I'm going to be the moderator as well. So this is a community conference call hosted by, hosted by the United Way of Greater LA's Everyone In campaign. It's focused on building political and public will to end homelessness by creating more supportive and affordable housing across LA County. February is Black History Month. While it's no doubt a topic that should be celebrated year-round, we're using this opportunity to look at the challenges many Black people across Los Angeles face disproportionately: homelessness, housing instability, and limited home ownership. Our goal is for this conversation to flow like a panel discussion. I know it's kind of a challenge on Zoom, but we're going to do our best, and we have great people that are going to talk about this very important issue. We've received some questions in advance of today's call, so we'll try to answer those during the conversation as well as at the end. If you're watching on Zoom, you can ask questions throughout the Q&A box at the very bottom of the screen. We'll try to answer them in real time or again later on in social media. On social media, follow us or follow it at everyone in LA. Everyone in LA on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of them. I don't know if Snap just yet, but I'm sure we'll get there. There are 4 parts to today's conversation. Firstly, we're going to talk about efforts to reshape our government systems to legitimately address racial equity and to support Black home ownership. Second, we're going to look at homelessness in the Black community more specifically, and what leaders are doing to reverse these painful trends. Third, we'll learn about new ideas to create more housing that people can afford and to activate private capital to support Black and Brown communities. And then finally, we're going to hear what you can do to support these efforts. For each group of panelists, I'll start with a question and then we'll move on to a group discussion. So let's get started. The pandemic has elevated public consciousness about systemic racism and the disproportionate impacts that Black, Brown, and low-income communities face. While this isn't news to advocates or most of you folks who are tuning in, the increased level of discussion in media, including the LA Times, where I work at, and elsewhere has been real. Policy conversations have more directly acknowledged the present-day consequences of redlining and housing segregation, for example. 2 examples of systemic reform that we're going to explore today are LA County's Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative, as well as the LA Homeless Service Authority's Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness. We'll also discuss opportunities and obstacles to invest in Black communities and build wealth. So for our first part of this discussion, we're going to have to talk about these critical issues are Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza. He's Executive Director of Racial Equity with the Los Angeles County CEO's Office. Lori Gay is President and CEO of Neighborhood Housing Services of Los Angeles County. And Earl Edwards, he's a researcher, educator, advocate, and consultant. He facilitated LAHSA's Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness. Sorry, someone's calling me on Zoom. I'm going to turn that over. And is currently pursuing his PhD at UCLA. Go Bruins. Welcome to you all. So Dr. Scorza, let's start with you. People may not be aware that LA County has created this initiative and that you're leading it. Can you share a little context about what your goals are for it and how you're working to get there?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you all for having me on today's panel. And I always send my love out to my fellow Bruins. So good to see you there. To all of you who are here today. And look, if you're at USC too, I'll send my love that way. But you know where my heart lies. So listen, I'm excited and proud to have been selected to lead the county's efforts to address racism, both institutionally, but also throughout our communities. The Board of Supervisors in July of 2020 boldly affirmed that racism was a public health crisis and it had reached crisis proportions for folk in our communities, especially for Black people. And as we know, issues like redlining, have led to not only increased levels of not only segregated neighborhoods in our communities, but has also created containers for inequity, right? So communities live in spaces that we call are concentrated and accumulated disadvantage, where there's been significant divestment in resources, where there have been issues like over policing, where there have been significant concerns around school quality. And the county, in recognizing these challenges, have asked me to help lead an effort to evaluate its policies, practices, operations, and programs through a racial equity lens, to look at opportunities to bring folk from our communities into employment within the county, and to have a policy agenda that will allow the county to lead as the largest county in the country, to lead at the local, state, and federal level on issues related to anti-racism and racial equity. So that should sort of give you a good broad sense of the initiative thus far. But in practice, what that really means is that we're going to explore how the county services can be targeted in ways that close disparities as a $38 billion institution, how we mobilize and utilize resources of the county, and then map out where we know disparities exist, so that ultimately throughout the county, between philanthropy, government agencies, local and regional agencies as well, private institutions, we can really begin to target locations where disparities exist and invest in those communities through sort of a strategic racial equity framework.
So you almost start like with an audit of the entire, as you said, $38 billion complex, and figure out, okay, this is what's doing good. This is what we need to work on. Let's go.
That's right. And think about how we're utilizing our resources, right? Are we actually putting our dollars into places where there's the greatest degree of need?
Yeah. Earl, while Black people make up 9% of the county, they comprise nearly 40% of the people experiencing homelessness. You facilitated a committee that worked to impact this shameful statistic. What key conclusions can you share?
Yeah, and I kind of want to echo what Dr. Scorza was saying, and the data matters, right? And so once we actually started disaggregating our homeless count data to actually see the racial and ethnic differences of individuals experiencing homelessness, we started to see how large this disproportionate number of Black people were experiencing homelessness. And community members were really concerned and really pushed agencies to really address this issue. And so LASA created a commission, an ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness. And that actually was led by Commissioner Jacqueline Wagner and Kelly Bernard, and had about 27 members on the committee. And the members range from pastors and church leaders in the Black community, deputies in the city and county offices, service providers, community organizers, and most importantly, Black people with lived experience of homelessness. Veronica Lewis actually was one of the committee members who was also on this Zoom call. And so I had the privilege of helping co-facilitate those meetings, but also to lead the initiative around the community listening sessions. So I went to the various spas in LA County to talk to Black people and to people experiencing homelessness, and people who are in the community that had a really strong desire to fix this issue around homelessness, and ask them, why do they think Black people are experiencing homelessness at disparate rates?
And what were those folks telling you?
Yeah, so the report really found that structural racism was a key driver. And how structural racism works is that the layering of institutional disadvantage was actually creating a unique experience for Black people that would cause them to fall into homelessness more often, and also stay homeless and houseless for a lot longer. So when you think about housing discrimination, employment discrimination, the disparate negative outcomes of the carceral system, the education system, child welfare system, all those things were coming together to make adverse experiences for Black people, and also to prevent a lot of the universal policies that we had to address homelessness from actually helping support that population. There was actually an article in the LA Sentinel in 1987, and the number of Black people experiencing homelessness was actually 38%. And they actually had a homeless count of about 50,000 people. And you look at when this actual committee came together, the numbers were almost exactly the same. So it shows us that the policies that we had in place before were not working. And so this actual committee came together to make 60 recommendations that actually targeted resources to the Black community to actually alleviate this issue.
Wow. Lori, you've spent your career working to invest in under-resourced communities and support home ownership. Can you offer insights about the opportunities and obstacles you've faced in this work, especially recently?
Hi, thanks for having us. So opportunities are infinite, challenges are as well. And while we're talking about BIPOC communities, we're leading with Black, we know that all communities of color struggle and always have. And it's been generations, not just decades. Everybody likes to talk about the last 50 years, kill all that. We've been struggling the whole time. And when every time there's an open door, there's also a fence and a hurdle, people give up and they lose hope and faith in what can happen. And so it's been our intention, particularly in the last 3 years, to increase Black homeownership numbers in the region and throughout the country. I co-chair a national group of Black community developers. We all have a homeownership emphasis and a multifamily housing emphasis and a homeless response emphasis. It's the continuum of housing. We do not need to let other people dictate our path. And that we got to speak up to change it. And so that's part of our advocacy push. And I think for me, I grew up, my father was a pastor, he never punched a clock. I grew up being the only Black in my schools beyond my siblings, getting spit on and called out of my name every day right here in California. So I'm not interested in being cute or convenient anymore. And I don't suggest that we have been, but I would say that we've always played nice in the sandbox. Now I want to have no box and throw the sand everywhere. So how do we do that? And how do we get about the business of making sure that Black folks can get into the spaces they certainly can achieve and then stay in the ones they want to stay in? Gentrification first starts with economics. When buppies, Black urban professionals, don't want to live in the neighborhood because it's Madeir's house, and I don't prefer that because that neighborhood may not be as nice as, Westwood, that's a problem. That's a Black on Black crime scenario in my mind. If in fact Black legacy gets cut down, cultural and neighborhood legacy, community legacy, that's a problem. And so it's how do we push ourselves, start with our own selves, our own house, our own village, but then in terms of achieving home ownership, achieving the right cost of an affordable rental, right? Achieving, if you've been homeless as a Black person and now you want to get into permanent supportive housing, how do you do that? I've got a brother who's homeless. He makes poor choices. He doesn't represent the bulk of the homeless I've known in my lifetime, but he still makes poor choices. What's the opportunity for him? What's the opportunity for people who make better choices but run into systemic racism, systemic problems, right? So I want to push this continuum. I want to say home ownership is not an end game, it's a beginning. And I also want to always say, don't tell a low-income family what they can do on their housing. You don't have a right to do that. And so we have to be about the business of suggesting that on this continuum, people can go wherever they'd like, and how do we help them get there? No, we can't spend $250,000 a unit as down payment assistance. That would be dumb. But in a city where we're spending $600,000 to build permanent supportive housing per unit, that would be dumb. So we need political leadership that stops screwing around. Let's make the changes we need to make. I, for one, Tommy, would like to stop the conversation most of the time about homeless when it's 1% or less of the problem in housing. How do we help the people who need it most, but also help the people who need a bump up just a little step to be able to achieve permanent housing stability? And so that's our pitch. And I think, Gustavo, we have to be unabashed, unashamed now, all of us, to talk about it and understand our best strengths as service providers and lean into that. I don't need to be competitive with the United Way. That would be dumb, right? It's how do I help support, uplift, and help thrive what the United Way is doing by joining when Tommy calls me and taps me on the back. And I say, put me in, coach.
Yeah, I love that. I love all the metaphors you're saying. And I think that's important also. All of you are, working towards in your own avenues, in your own lanes to be ending systemic racism. So a question that I want all of you to answer, those are the, community of activists who are on the call today. What should they be doing to focus on their work to end systemic racism? Because that's like the thread that connects all of us here. Earl, if we could start with you.
Yeah, so I think all of us need to really be comfortable addressing anti-blackness directly. And oftentimes we try to have everything be with people of color or try to have very general policies that uplift everybody. And we know research shows us, experience shows us that if we don't target Black people directly for these resources, they don't get them. And if we don't solve this for the Black community, then we're not allowing ourselves to actually end these problems on a larger basis. Also, when you start from the bottom, it always helps the rest. It always helps the rest. So we actually have policies that are attacking housing discrimination for Black people. We're actually having policies that are attacking housing discrimination generally. And so it's really important that we look at it from that frame and attack and have resolutions that explicitly talk about Black people.
No, definitely. Lori, your response?
I agree with what Earl just said. Love that. And I think it's being cognizant, aware in the moment. I'm ashamed that George Floyd was a trigger for so much of what's going on right now. That hurts all of us. But what are we going to do with it, right? And we can change the systemic pieces. I was just on a call last night. We had the recent CIDLAC TCAC round. 35 Black-led organizations that applied did not get funded. How does that happen when we just had a BIPOC set aside under the TCAC rules? And so it's speaking up, and I'm speaking up because it's live on Facebook and it's recorded. That's a shame, and stop it. And how do we make sure that we change that? We find out what happened with that systemic system that builds the most affordable housing in the state, and how did 35 organizations get rejected? Were all their applications really that bad? Was there an intention to not make sure that people were successful? And so I think we've got to be vocal, and we have to then understand this is not about demeaning other groups of color. It's leading with Black because it's been the most systemic in our cultural group, and everyone is down when we're down. Yeah. And if we can get back to being more than 1% net worth of whites in Los Angeles, if the Fed study is accurate, then let's do that. And that brings all of the rising boats, or whatever that adage is, tides, whatever. It all comes up.
Dr. Scorza, 30-second response.
So as someone who grew up dealing with homelessness, having lived in a shelter, having lived in my mom's car, having been evicted because we couldn't afford rent, I can tell you, and as someone who also built a nonprofit that fought for housing justice in Inglewood, which is where I'm from, I can tell you that it's not only about sort of being aware, it's about being able to mobilize to push government to recognize the role that it has in systemic racism. I think one of our commenters talked about Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, right? There are de jure actions that government has taken, right? Not just de facto segregation, it's been de jure, where government has made policy to lead to the challenge we deal with. So I would encourage you all to push your government institutions to commit to changing systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices, and to then work to co-create solutions with the populations most affected by those adverse outcomes, utilizing a racial equity lens in decision-making, and focus on the budget. Stop going after the training that's important, you need it. Stop going after the programming, we need that too, right? Like if we focus on those things, that's helpful. But I mean, put your energy where the money is being spent, and I promise you we'll start seeing significant change.
Follow the money is always very, very good advice. Thank you so much to each of you for what you do and for being here.
Thank you.
Now we're going to go to our next segment. We're going to explore homelessness in the Black community and what efforts are underway to solve some of the obstacles at both the systemic and community levels. So here to share their perspectives, I'm going to introduce first Veronica Lewis. She's director of SSG Hopics, a nonprofit service provider that works in South Los Angeles. Eric Gaddis is the senior manager, homeless system change with United Way's Home for Good initiative. And James Licavoli is supervisor of the CD8 Navigation Center, a place for restoring a sense of dignity to our homeless neighbors. Thank you all for being here. Veronica, let's start with you. You heard Earl talk earlier about the insights and recommendations that came out of this committee he helped lead. What's your perspective on that committee's work and homelessness in the Black community more broadly? Veronica? think?
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you, Gustavo. Yeah, first of all, I want to say I think it's really critical that we're having conversations, real conversations about the issues that Black people are experiencing, and being able to have platforms where we specifically talk about Black people. As Lori said, several groups of color are impacted, but there are some historical pieces that create some additional dynamics for Black people. So I'm grateful that our committee, in a way, spearheaded that effort, and quite frankly, is being looked at across the nation to empower folks to just name it. And name it and then address it. And so housing instability and homelessness is unfortunately one of many disparities that Black people experience. So having a focus on bringing Black people inside to a stable housing situation is certainly one of the key steps we should be taking in order to figure out how to meaningfully begin to address the many barriers. But it's also critical that we look at the overarching policy. So there's been several references to specific policies earlier, but in particular related to the policies driving housing and economic growth and investment, and not only looking at them, but calling out and ridding them of the biases and the racism and anti-Black sentiment that's embedded within them, because we won't get to the true paradigm shift of addressing these disparities head on if we don't look at that. I'm currently reading the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, and I think that anybody really interested in understanding how to dive into this work and advocate for a true paradigm shift to take a look at it, because all of this, unfortunately and painfully, is by design. It's not by mistake. It was done by design, and we are here to turn it over. There's a multi-layer issue. This is a multi-layer issue. It's not just related to homelessness. As Mark Ridley Thomas always says, homelessness is the most extreme manifestation of poverty. And that is truly something I believe. And so, you know, I support and I'm a part of drilling down to figure out like specific programmatic fixes to try to begin to support Black people. And some of that work is happening actually as a part of the ad hoc committee, and I'm co-chairing one of the implementation groups. But quite frankly, if we don't look at the systemic and sustained change that it takes, we're really not going to make a difference. We're going to be having Band-Aid solutions. And so I'm hoping that, you know, by having these conversations, by putting some things on some of the audience's minds, we can look at how do we really shift these policies that are racist, so that as we move forward 10, 15, 20 years, the policies are not subject to the ebbs and flows of who's in office. But we've really done a clear analysis of how so many Black people, in comparison to how many Black people live in LA County, have become homeless, make adjustments so that we have sustained change regardless of who's sitting in office, because we've done the hard work, having uncomfortable conversations, and that's what it's going to take to move this thing forward.
I like that idea, systemic and sustained. That's just a really great way of, you know, of thinking of all of this. Eric, the United Way has worked to end homelessness for roughly a decade. So where's the organization focused right now when it comes to homelessness in the Black community?
Yeah, thank you, Gustavo. I will say that, you know, over the past decade, I think United Way has been on a journey of figuring out how do we get to the structural root causes of homelessness. And I think in recent years, we've started acknowledging and working very much hard on the fact that, you know, the homeless crisis is a housing crisis. And I think where we're at right now, in February 2021, we recognize that we have to zoom out more and get deeper, that this is about, you know, the original sin of this country. This is about acknowledging that you can't talk about homelessness or the housing crisis without talking about, you know, carceral justice, the criminalization of Black communities, economic racism. And so I think that where we're at now is doing just that, is figuring out what our role in acknowledging and fighting for racial justice. I'll also add, and I just want to say as a non-Black person of color, that I couldn't fully agree more, that not to be divisive, but we have to fully acknowledge that, you know, we're talking about the distinction, the unique challenges of anti-Blackness in its history. And so I fully agree with what everyone's saying, and we can do both, acknowledge people of color as being disproportionately impacted while also highlighting that this is a specific, unique Black issue. I'll add that, you know, we're looking at that in all aspects of our organization, both internally and externally, through our advocacy and grant making, from every level of our board, executive leadership, and staff. And so we're trying to be intentional in that. Obviously, our role in Measure J, the historic ballot measure in November, spoke to that we're really talking about, as Dr. Scorza said, how do we look at follow the money? How do we look at existing resources, but also how do we get more resources, and more resources to people who who are leading this efforts in Black communities by Black communities. And so I think that we also have to balance our intentional goals with the fact that there's an urgency to this. And there's people that have been doing this for a very long time who have this analysis, and we need to hand the reins over and figure out how we can be an ally in that efforts. And that ultimately this is about racial justice, and all the things about ending homelessness and housing justice has to be brought forth through a frame of racial justice. And that's the best way that we can advance the work to end homelessness in LA.
We'll get back to Measure J in a little bit. James, as a peer advocate and case manager, you work with people who are trying to regain stability in their lives every day. What are some of the obstacles to securing that stability?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just want to start by saying, for me, being homeless was the most difficult thing that I've ever been through. There's a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of, for me, in some ways, self-hate. I felt filthy. I felt like I didn't belong. It's really hard to be homeless. It's hard to not know when your next meal is. It's hard to not know if you're going to get robbed. I became addicted to drugs on the streets because I just didn't want to go to sleep. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. So it was almost as hard for me to go from homeless to reintegrate into society. Just for lack of a better word, it was hard for me to go from no structure to all of a sudden having to have a structure. My credit was shot. I had evictions. I was ashamed to ask for help. There was, I hate to sound cliche, but there was no light at the end of the tunnel for me. I had no mentor, spent a lot of my life thinking that I really knew everything, and becoming homeless just was a big blow to my pride. So I'll speak from a lens, from my own lens, and from some of the clients that we work with, a lot of the barriers that they're facing. And I think I'm looking at this more so on the participant or the person rather than systemically. It's lack of support systems, potentially criminal records, old habits. We all know old habits die hard. A lot of times the way programming is rolled out, it's very difficult to navigate. There's a lack of mentorship. There's a lack of understanding between the folks that our homeless neighbors are working with sometimes. Self-love, that was one of the tough ones for me, was rebuilding kind of a belief in myself. Of course, credit issues, trusting the folks that you're working with, that they really have your best interest in mind. The company folks keep, the list goes on, but that's what I got.
Yeah, no, totally. Veronica, let's go back to you and Measure J. You're playing a leadership role in its implementation. And just in case if you folks don't remember, Measure J, voters approved in November, sets a minimum funding requirement for alternatives to incarceration and direct community investment. So what intersections do you see with homelessness and Measure J, if any?
There certainly is an intersection. So the whole premise of Measure J, as Eric started to talk about, is to reimagine LA being a place where the policies, practices, and the funding, and even the motivation for how we support individuals is truly through a care first and jails last approach. And so this means that the aim is to prevent people from being incarcerated, and obviously to mitigate people who will return home from going back into incarceration. And Measure J represents a fraction, ultimately, once it's fully rolled out, of county general funds that will be used to both expand economic development and provide an array of direct services, including housing services, mental health, addiction treatment, and a variety of things. And so it's commonly known that many individuals who are attached to the criminal justice system or justice system are homeless or unstably housed. And interestingly enough, though, homelessness is both a cause and effect, vice versa. And I don't know that that's explored enough, but I think that is at the core when you talk about intersectionality. And so basically, housing and economic instability, mental health, addiction, trauma, which hasn't been brought up, but I want to bring that up for Black people. There's community trauma, there's personal trauma. Those things are main drivers for incarceration and should also be the things that we're addressing in the community, as opposed to throwing people into jail or prison. And so that's where the intersection is, because a lot of the things that have led to being unstable in many ways, not just related to housing, resulting in people being incarcerated and not supported, or vice versa. So really looking forward to creating some specific responses for housing, building on the existing homeless services and housing system that we have in LA County, but also recognizing, which is something quite frankly I've been fighting for the last 3 years, that there are some specific nuances related to how you reduce recidivism, how you help support returning citizens, and that's what Measure J is all about. Care first, jails last.
Awesome. Eric, another question for you. So there's, I know, controversy with a federal judge from where I'm from, Orange County, Judge David O. Carter, who's trying to play now an active role in homelessness up in LA. We like him down here in OC, but is he being helpful in LA? Could he be helpful?
I think I'll emphasize the could be, right? I think it's a little bit, I think it's to be determined. I think here's what we know is true. There's an entrenched crisis both in our streets and in the system to end homelessness on the housing policy side. I think there's an entrenched politic right now where we've been going in circles to a certain extent and struggling to pierce through all the noise for solutions. And so I would say that any kind of disruption to that can be solutions oriented, that can take all the different parties and cooks in the kitchen and get them in line is valuable. I think that, however, I will say that ultimately what we need to focus on is this an opportunity to find new resources, right, for permanent housing versus trying to figure out a way to keep cutting the existing pie for short-term solutions, right? And so I think if we can all get in line and say that this is an opportunity to do that and the judge can play a role in that, great. But ultimately, we know that a judge is not going to be the one who ends homelessness, that we need policymakers to address policy failures, that we need new money where there hasn't been enough in specific communities like Black communities. However, the risk that involved is that this will be just another added complicated factor in an already crowded kind of space. And so we're hopeful of that. We need new resources for permanent solutions. We don't need, taking existing resources and putting towards interim solutions or short-term solutions. And so I will say it's to be determined. There are times where when I'm personally a little concerned about the direction things are going, but I do think right now there's an opportunity, and I hope that the judge and all those who are in conversation with them seize that moment.
Thank you. And then a final question for all of you, just with a 1-minute response, because we're almost out of time for this segment. If y'all had a magic wand and could do one thing to end homelessness in the Black community and beyond, what would it be? Let's start with Veronica.
Economic stability for me. We would create true, massive, comprehensive mechanisms to have sustained economic stability so that we can prevent Black people from falling into homelessness, which hasn't been lifted up much today, but is part of this conversation, and also help those that we have helped move from homelessness into housing stay that way.
Eric, what about you?
I mean, I wish I could say anything more. I'll just say a plus one to that and say, economic reparations is a very concrete way of doing that. I would say, if we're talking magic wand, big picture, I think there's a lot between that. But simply put, I think that massive economic and wealth realignment towards those who have been divested from and had their wealth taken from them over the past, few centuries.
Thousands of years almost. James, how about you and why?
So I think for me, the homeless system in itself right now has kind of poverty separated. So you're homeless or you're impoverished. I think if we were to serve the two alike, because they're very closely conjoined, that would help. But Dr. Sharon with DMH said something to me one time that I really appreciated. And he said, if we could remove kind of the red tape around programming and be outcome oriented. So stop telling me how I can program and tell me what you want done. What is the outcome? What do we want? And let me figure out how to do it. I think that would help.
Awesome. Thank you to all of you for being part of this conversation. I really appreciate it. Now we're going to go on to part 3 of our conversation. We're going fast. Even though it's huge topics, we got to talk really, really fast, especially me. A few years ago, a report called The Color of Wealth showed white households in LA have a median net worth of $355,000. In comparison, Black households, they had a median net worth of $4,000. These are vast differences, disturbing, driven by generational exclusion from wealth-building opportunities. Here to talk about efforts to build wealth across these communities are Martin Motto. He's the founder and CEO of Sola Impact, and Jason Riff. And Jason Riff, he's Director of Housing Initiatives with United Way of Greater Los Angeles. So Martin, What is Sola Impact and why did you start the organization?
Thanks for having us on. I love the dialogue so far, and it catalyzed a lot of the thoughts we've had over the decade. Sola Impact is a affordable housing developer focused primarily on Los Angeles, which is obviously predominantly African American and Latinx community. But we're significantly more than that. We're a double bottom line company. What does that mean? It means that we believe that for us to do well, the community must do well. For us to do well, our tenants
I hope
really improve.
Sorry, you zapped out there for a little bit.
Did I break up?
Yeah, just reiterate that point really quickly.
You know, we believe that for us to do well, the community must do well, and our tenants must do well. And the way, one of the many ways, through partnership, and we've really partnered, and it's great to see so many partners here, not only the United Way, but Ms. Veronica Lewis at Hopics and the folks at NHS. You know, it's really bringing together a community of nonprofits, of private capital, of government, of policy, and working together to address these issues. So at a very broad level, that's the framework we believe really moves the needle in communities of color.
And you also recently launched the $1 billion Black Impact Fund. What inspired that and what are the goals for it?
In many respects, you know, what inspired that was both a decade of working in low-income communities, which unfortunately have a high correlation to Black and Brown communities, and all of the lessons that we've learned over that decade. The other very meaningful set of factors was what happened over the summer. And we wanted to make sure that that was not a moment, but a movement. They have been over $66 billion of commitments by leading organizations to Black and Brown causes and diversity and inclusion. And we wanted to make sure that there was an accountability there. Now we are out there trying to pull together private capital behind the Black Impact Fund. But as even the name implies, our exclusive focus is Black and Brown communities beyond South Los Angeles to all of California and up and down the West Coast, where this housing crisis is really a pandemic, and it's manifesting in many ways. What people remind me, what institutional investors remind me is it's never been done before. A Black-led fund investing exclusively in Black and Brown communities, trying to raise $1 billion, it's never been done before. And I go, why not? And the time is now to be on the right side of history. So we're fighting that battle, and we've been getting some incredible traction.
That's great. That's really great to hear. Jason, the United Way has worked to figure out how it can help create more housing for extremely low-income people, particularly with private capital. Anything you can share on what the organization is doing?
Yeah, definitely, Gustavo. And thank you, Martin, for painting that picture. Sola's doing some amazing work locally and across the region. So, you know, I think it's most interesting for us to look at housing justice as racial justice, right? United Way is really leaning into this issue and thinking through how can we work to end extreme poverty across greater LA. So in that spirit, we're standing up the Immediate Housing Initiative, which I think addresses this most directly. How's it work? We're piloting a shared housing development model that we believe can be replicated across distinct zoning types that will also provide rental units that rent for less than $1,000. We're targeting $800 to $900 per unit, which can help individuals exiting homelessness and also help those who might slip into homelessness by providing a room that they can actually afford. In addition to the models, we're also raising a fund so that developers can receive private capital to account for acquisition costs, pre-development costs, and construction costs along with the model. And we believe that this will help us scale and build quicker and cheaper across LA. You know, we're estimating that construction timelines will be reduced by 12 months. We think that this fund will help us cut the cost of development in half compared to what's being built using public dollars. And across 3 phases, our total impact across 4 or 5 years should be 60 developments built, 2,000 individuals housed, total raise around $300 million. That's the primary initiative that United Way is rolling out in the next few weeks. So you should be hearing more about it, and definitely looking to partners like Martin and NHS and the other nonprofit developers across LA to help us with this work.
That's awesome. A question for both of you. A lot of our conversation today has focused on what systemic change means in the public and nonprofit sectors, especially when it comes to budgets and programs. The two of you have talked more about private sector ideas. So I'm curious, where do you think the biggest opportunities to drive racial equity and systemic change forward through private sector and private investment beyond what you've already shared?
Yeah,
We'll start with Martin. Yeah.
I think we've got to bring the private sector along, and I think that they've got to realize that this problem affects everybody in community, and I think COVID really reinforces that we're all interconnected, whether you are a CEO or a hedge fund manager, or whether you're one of the most vulnerable in society. And I think that message is finally getting across. I think it's very important. I think it's also important to look at this in a much broader lens and help the private sector understand that we're a affordable housing developer using private capital, but to us, affordable housing is only the first base. Second base is
Second base. Let's hold that thought, folks.
my
Just second base again. I love baseball metaphors, so go for it.
second base is access to education in technology and using technology. Third base is access to capital. And fourth base is access to ownership, both home ownership for Black and Brown individuals, but also business ownership. And in some respects, it's ownership of one's own destiny, right? And so really framing it in that way and showing how private capital can play a role in all of those pillars is part of what we're trying to do in the Black Impact Fund.
Jason, your response.
Yeah, I think, some strong thoughts have been shared by Martin and also Eric earlier. Most important is to really double down on having the hard conversations with the investors, the vendors, the donors who we work with. I've really been pushing United Way internally to hold those conversations with their board to directly say, what are you doing to address racial equity, and how are you going to double down on this issue? That leads to them finding ways to engage deeper with us in our work, and I think that's the most effective thing that we can do. Sol has done some really great work on kind of expanding to education and access to digital technology and things like that, which also help. But again, we have to have the hard conversations with the people who have, deep pockets to move these issues and bring them to the table.
Yeah, the hope, sadly within coronavirus and also this past summer is that everyone, all sectors of society realize it's, from the least of us to the supposed highest of us, we're all interconnected, and we need to all solve all of this together. So thank you, Martin and Jason. We'll have to leave it there for now. A lot of questions coming in. You're seeing in the chat, a lot of questions were also submitted in advance. So we're going to elevate two of them right now. So our first question is from John in LA, and we're going to direct this one to Veronica Lewis. And he says, I own a film and TV production company in Los Angeles and would like to establish an intern program that helps Los Angeles communities that do not have access to such programs. So Veronica, any thoughts on how business owners can connect to organizations like yours and others, or is this already something that happens?
Sure. I mean, you've heard us talk about economic development. Many of us have uplifted that, and a lot of that starts with opportunities for people to build skills so they can enter professions that they might not otherwise have an opportunity to. So I have three thoughts about that. One is, yes, I think connecting to organizations that are providing support to people that are living in poverty and or homeless so that you can offer internship opportunities to those folks is number one. Number two, I think that actually designing some of your video production internship programs around helping us to tell the stories of Black people and people experiencing homelessness, because part of what it's going to take to create the sustained change that I referenced is, quite frankly, to change and shift some of the narrative and perspective of the people who are voting on these measures and who possibly can support. And so creating an internship program that not only pulls people from the community that we've been talking about today, but also that uplifts their stories potentially. And then thirdly, going back to economic development, I think there's a lot of initiatives, and you heard Eric speak to some of them. Measure J could be one of them, that's looking at opportunities, again, to build skills. And so even aligning your internship programs, because the one thing that's concerning about a lot of the programs for people that are in poverty or homeless is that everybody wants them to train and do stuff for free. when they have an actual need to have money now. And so, you know, internship is great, but possibly aligning your video production company with some of the people that works for centers or other entities that have on the job training and apprenticeship dollars would be even better. So we can pay people while they learn.
Thank you for offering that, John. It's so important. Narrative always, including, you know, my paper. Our second question was submitted anonymously, and Eric Gades, we're going to throw this one to you. I've been struggling during COVID and I'm worried about getting evicted. Is there any help available? Sadly, this is a question that not just this anonymous question, but so many people have.
Yeah.
So Eric, any suggestions?
Yeah, sure. Anonymous is almost appropriate because who isn't? I bet you everyone on this call, everyone we know has somebody who's at this risk. So I appreciate the question. First of all, shout outs and acknowledgement and love to whoever submitted that question, everybody going through this. I'll say a couple things. No one should be evicted right now. There is an eviction moratorium currently in the state of California. You have rights even if you are when you go into the process of eviction. There's a lot of information. I'll plug one thing. stayhousedla.org is a resource where you can learn about your rights and have access to tenant rights. But more importantly, it's about after the pandemic. That's the real wave that we're concerned about, right? And so United Way and Everyone In just had a webinar on this. You can go to the Everyone In Facebook page where you could plug in to review that webinar where you'll learn more about the resources that are on the way on the federal level. There's some resources on the way on the federal and state level. It is insufficient, quite honestly. So there's also avenues to plug in on the advocacy side so you could join the fight so that we get enough resources for folks so no one has to be evicted as a result of the pandemic. So I'll just say that for now.
Awesome. Thank you for the answer, and thank you everyone who submitted questions beforehand. Make sure to follow the Everyone In campaign on social media. Remember, it's at Everyone In LA across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Folks here in this panel will continue to answer questions in the future. So now it's gone very fast, but the final part of today's conversation, I'd like to welcome Tommy Newman. He's a senior director with the United Way of Greater LA, who helps to lead the Everyone In campaign, which is hosting today's event. So Tommy, one question came from Joyce, who is retired and wants to help to push for change. How can she do that?
Fully appreciate it. Appreciate Joyce's question. I wasn't going to be able to miss the opportunity to invite people to sign up for the Everyone In campaign, and I appreciate Gustavo's plugs through the course of our call today, because this is our work. This is why this campaign exists. This campaign represents the evolution and growth of the United Way as an organization. It also represents an attempt to help drive big ideas forward and to drive the change that we need. And so I'm proud to be a part of it with so many of the people who helped make this call happen today. So sign up for the campaign, everyoneinla.org, Joyce, and we got lots of things you can do, which we would really appreciate your help. I'll also just take a quick moment to appreciate everybody who made the time to be on this call today, each one of our panelists, the hundreds of people who have been with us either via Zoom or on Facebook. It's been inspirational for me, a reminder of the work that we need to do as an organization, the work that we need to do as a community. It's also inspiring to see so many leaders who are driving this work forward across the county. So just appreciate all of you and your time and everybody who's here, and look forward to being together again soon. Back to you, Gustavo.
No, thank you. Over 200 people on a Friday during lunchtime for this conversation. I think it shows both the urgency of the matter, but also the interest in trying to make a better future, as all of our panelists said today. So as a reminder, the Everyone In campaign is going to answer more of these questions on social media. I know I've plugged a lot, but it's all about the plugs, folks. So anything we didn't get to today will be addressed there. Please hit them up at Everyone In LA, all one word, at Everyone In LA on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, send them DMs, at them, whatever you need to do. But if you have any more questions, especially there's so many questions that we didn't answer today, please do just ask them through there. So we hope that today's event was helpful and informative. If you RSVP through the everyoneinla.org website, they'll follow up with resources via email and plan to do another call like this one in the future. Quick plug for me, I'm a columnist for Los Angeles Times. If there's any stories, especially about inequities, whatever, please email me, gustavo.arellano@latimes.com. I really try to, celebrate all the good folks, but also go after the bad folks. So please do get in contact with me. So thank you again. It was an honor to do this. Until then, next time, be well and gracias.